Hey, good afternoon. We appreciate you attending this week's Coaching Academy. And again, we will discuss a different type of programming that also has a big influence on the development of my specific programming, the tier system. This is one of the reasons why last week I wanted to talk about the 4-day split, and then today talk about the principles of high intensity training, or HIT, because both of these programmings had a huge factor in the way I developed the tier system. There was certain principles of the 4-day split and certain principles of the HIT programming that I believed in some type of combination could have a huge benefit to our athletes. So first off, high intensity training, or HIT. The biggest thing I want to discuss right off the bat is the definition of intensity as it relates to high intensity training. In this case, we are talking about intensity of effort, because the principle of high intensity training in the purest sense is to push one specific exercise, one set, to a momentarily muscular failure. So that's where you get to intensity of effort. The ultimate goal is maximum exertion for that set on that specific exercise. That's not to be confused with training intensities, which is generally utilized when you're doing a percentage-based program off of said repetition max. So a definition of that would be, if I bench press 400 pounds, my training intensity for the week is 70% for 3 sets of 7. That 70% is the training intensity of 400 pounds. You take the 400, multiply it by 70%, and your training load for that week is 280 pounds. So there is a huge difference between intensity of effort and training intensity. That has to be defined. Because if you get into discussions with the purist of HIT, they will always tell you they are at 100% intensity, where someone like myself who uses training intensity would say, well, we're in a moderate session today because we were only using 70%. But that doesn't mean I still want a lot of exertion in my sets. The big difference is their intensity of effort is what drives the program. By trying to reach momentarily muscular failure, it's a great way to induce hypertrophy gains. So that's the big thing I wanted to discuss first, the difference between intensity of effort and training intensity. And let's remember, the primary emphasis of HIT is to do a whole body program in brief periods of time. But with that exertion, you may have longer rests. The base level of high intensity training is based off of a 3-day whole body system. Sound familiar? But the difference is, if there's a high level of intensity of effort and the exertion point exceeds pure maximal effort intensity, because we'll talk about how we push past momentary muscular failure with 2 principles that high intensity coaches will use, it could lead to longer breaks in recovery. There have been times, and I know especially those who train with Dr. Ken Leisner out of Long Island, where they would go possibly only twice a week, and also at times once every 8 days, because the muscle soreness, the delayed muscle soreness, was that long to recover. So there's highs and lows, there's positives and negatives in every athletic-based type of training or any type of training you're performing with your athletes. So that's something to acknowledge early on. The tempo of the rep is the important part of high-intensity training. They are going to do a very slow approach to a repetition speed. Their concentric and eccentric components are going to be based on certain counts or seconds per set, so to speak. The general rule for high intensity training is 6 to 7 seconds per rep. That's generally been broken down into two specific ways that I have seen. One is just a 3-second eccentric or lowering phase, and then a 3-centric concentric positive phase, pushing phase or pulling phase, depending on the movement. I've also seen, and what I've been primarily used was a 4-count eccentric, 1-count midpoint hold, and then a 2-count concentric. So you're going to get 6 to 7 second reps, and then you're going to push those to a higher volume of repetitions per that set if you're utilizing a 1 set to failure approach. Again, the duration of this, because the maximal exertion of effort you will only need to perform in realistic and the ultimate goal, if it's done correctly, 1 set per exercise, is generally only going to be around 30 minutes. So it's not a very, very long-term duration program. It's actually very brief if it's done correctly. When I was utilizing high-intensity training to prepare one of my athletes in the 90s, because he was going to an NFL team that had a high-intensity based training program, it took us 22 minutes to get him through a full body program, and he was spent for 3 days. So there is some interesting concepts to building hypertrophy as well as some conditioning aspects to high-intensity training. In the processes of placing this in your annual plan, so say you are someone like myself, or you're an Olympic-based, or you're a powerlifting-based, or whatever you consider yourself when you're training your athletes, is there a place for high-intensity training in the annual plan? I believe there is. I think it can easily be adapted in a 3-week phase during a transitional period, where generally for football players, let's say, or most athletes that have discretionary time during the month of May before they head into their summer programs, would be an ideal time to change the stimulus. Now, it's very important that you have a coach who understands the philosophy to do this with you, but most athletes can push certain points to exertion if they're educated correctly, if they had to do it on their own. But it is a good variation if they're off campus to give them a change of stimulus before they come back on. Or if you didn't go to the playoffs, and you didn't have a chance to go to a bowl game, and you have a longer break, so your rejuvenation stage is long before you start the developmental process of the next year, you could even add that to the later stages of that right before the athlete comes back to campus and starts your developmental program. So I do believe there are aspects of high-intensity training that can be fit in the program. Do I do it all the time? Not really. Has it happened and occurred? Of course it has. I believe in some of the principles of the whole body training, and I do believe in adaptation to training stimulus, and this would be a great way to change the adaptation. Now, for standard program design, I've only put up 3 exercises. I'll walk us through the rest. But as you saw on the blog, if you read it, primarily it's a whole body approach utilizing specific body parts for 1 set of high volume reps going to momentarily muscular failure. So for example, if we were looking just at a 3 movement leg program in a standard HIT program, it generally starts with a potentiation or pre-fatigue of the hamstring. And I've seen most of the time that would be a 15 rep set. That goes followed. You literally walk off the leg curl machine and you're onto the leg press. 20 plus reps I have seen most of the time. I have seen sets, I've never done up to 100, but I know that there has been coaches that have pushed 100 rep leg press sets. The most I had ever done under these principles was during a testing phase where I did a 50 rep set at 400 pounds on an old AMF hip sled. And to be honest with you, I really couldn't walk for 4 or 5 days. Luckily, we were going into break. Then it's followed by the quadriceps, and set of 12 leg extension. There were times where we would do a heel raise for calf work, and I know other programs also added dorsiflexion. So they covered almost every movement of the lower body. Also, back in the Nautilus days, there was a Nautilus hip and glute, and that was sometimes factored in. So there's generally going to be 3 to possibly 6 exercises that would hit your lower body in the terms of high intensity training. Now remember what I said, the goal is momentarily muscular failure, but how do you go through that point of exertion and push the athlete further? This generally happened by utilizing 2 distinct methods. One was drop sets. So the athlete performs 15 reps at a specific load. He does it or she does it under perfect technical efficiency. On the 16th rep, they fail. The coach would then drop 20 pounds and continue to stress the athlete for the leg curl or the hamstring movement. The other way was negatives. And what you would do there is the coach would literally push the lying leg curl up, and then you would lower for a 6 to 8 count negative. Those 2 ways really pushed you over the limit of exertion, and that's where the extra days of recovery occur from the delayed onset of muscle soreness. Once we have piggybacked the legs, most of the time in the Nautilus principles, and remember, HIT training really got its forefront from Dr. Arthur Jones, the creator of Nautilus, and Dr. Ellington Darden. They became the hierarchy in the forefront of this type of training. My personal experience with it is Dan Riley really drove it home in the athletic-based world. He was doing a tremendous amount of work with it at Army. Penn State had jumped aboard at those times. And then when Dan went to the Washington Redskins, he won 3 Super Bowl titles utilizing this program. While I was in college in the 80s, I would say there was close to half of the NFL teams had partaked in some way, shape, or form of HIT training, and a lot of those coaches had worked for Dan Riley. So Dr. Darden and Dr. Jones have a lot to say about the creativity of HIT, but I think in the athletic sense, Dan Riley put it on the map. Now, Dorian Yates won 6 Olympic titles, and they talked about him using HIT training, and that is truthful. But the original bodybuilder who brought success to HIT training was Mike Mentzer. But Dorian Yates, in some of the research that I found, and I could be wrong, you can fact check me, and if I'm wrong, please let me know. But it was my understanding that Dorian actually used the DeLorme method of training, utilizing 2 work sets to get to the final set and then push that in an HIT fashion. And that's where you could utilize that cycle when you're doing high intensity training work with multiple sets for your big exercises. And here's an example of that. You would start the same way. You're going to do leg curl, and you're going to go 15 reps or to maximum muscular failure. We're going to utilize the DeLorme method. The DeLorme method was based off of 3 sets of 10 principle. And what it was you had your final set was your 100% of your 10 RM. So the first set was 50% of your 10 RM. Your second set was 75% of your 10 RM. And then your last set was what we would consider our high intensity training set of 100% of our 10 RM. And we're trying to push that to momentarily muscular failure. So if I was a 400-pound back squatter, it would be 200, 300, 400. So the first 2 sets are prepping me. I am getting some volume and work in. And then the last set I'm pushing for 10 RMs or more with technical efficiency. That's the one thing that has to be spoken about with this movement, with this type of protocol, is tempo of the rep as well as technical efficiency. Once the athlete had broke down, especially with this high volume of work, Once the athlete breaks down technical efficiency, the set is either over, or the coach would utilize drop sets or negative only. Then the program would follow as follows based off of your choice. Do you do a standard HIT or multi-set? Like I was saying, generally from here, the first upper body movement we always used in this type of plan was the Nautilus pullover, which I think is the first generation Nautilus pullover is one of the greatest machines that's ever been invented. That machine was one of the best things we ever had in our program. You can laugh all you want. I promise you it's one of the best pieces of equipment and best movements that were ever invented. And they messed it all up. But we would go dumbbell pullover, followed by the compound chest. And that was a chest fly to pre-fatigue the pecs, and then you would go into a chest press. That would be followed up by the compound shoulder. You do a lateral raise to pre-fatigue the shoulder, and then you'd go into a shoulder press, which was then followed by the rear delt machine. Sometimes we would utilize bicep and tricep. Most of the time with our strength coach, Joey Bullock, he had a little sadistic to him. We would go and do negative chins and dips. And if you're a big guy, you never wanted to see negative chins and dips to finish out the program. As our program evolved, I would say we became more of a multi-set type of HIT program because the football coaches wanted us to do some bigger lifts for sets and reps. So it was a combination of a little bit of both. Primarily though, a lot of our skilled athletes did a lot of the standard HIT. Some of the bigs, we did a lot of what looked like this, but we actually did percentage based. So it was a combination or a hybrid, which a lot of HIT coaches began to evolve to. So the same thing would happen here is we would start with some type of back or row, and then the bench press would follow something similar to that fashion. And then we would finish with a posterior shoulder and then move on to the accessories. The one thing we always started out with, and I guess that's one of the reasons why I'm a big proponent of doing the neck work on the front end of the program, is we almost always started with neck. It was either abs or neck. And I'll never forget, we had our circuit for neck was one of the best we could have ever imagined because we had the right pieces of equipment to isolate the neck. We had first generation Nautilus and would always start with the seated shrug. And we'd go 15, possibly 20 reps of seated shrug. That was followed by the standard 4-way neck machine. So we'd have forward flexion and extension, and then we'd have lateral flexion and extension. And those were usually between 10 and 12 reps. But the finisher was the key sadistic movement, was the old manual resistance rotary neck. If you haven't seen this machine, try to pull it up and Google it. You actually sat in the machine and the coach cranked the headpiece, and then he had two handles and he manually rotated your neck while you fought the resistance. Our neck sizes at Wake were incredibly large, and I think one of the big reasons was, and the reason why Joey had big forearms, was because of the rotary neck. That's a little humor for you, and I'm prepping you because Joey Bullock, my strength coach, will be on next Tuesday with us on our one-on-one. I saw a lot of quality hypertrophy development done in this program, if it is done right. Two of the best players that I worked with, I played with, that really benefited and showed what a pure HIT program can look like were two of our skilled athletes, Gunnar Brewer and Mark Casey. They performed the purest standardized HIT program to a T. Maybe that's why they were a couple of Joey's favorites, but they did it to a T. It was extremely impressive looking back how well they were able to actually do this. Intensity of effort with momentarily muscular failure and exertion. Let's face it, a lot of guys, you can figure out ways to make it look like you've hit momentary muscular failure. Those two guys took it to the next level. So again, I want to present certain parameters that you know are available to you so that you have an understanding of how you are building your program. Don't leave it up to somebody. I'm doing this program because Joe Ken does it. Or I'm doing this program because the University of so-and-so does it. Or I'm doing this program because my college strength coach did it. Or I'm doing this program because the guy who won the state championship's doing it. It has to be your program. You have to invest in the time of studying all the dynamics of program that are affordable to you, and then put that down on paper and figure out how to absorb, apply, and modify that information so that you can design a successful training program. Thank you very much. We will see you next Tuesday on our one-on-one live with my strength coach, Joey Bullock. Short, sweet, pretty good. Not a lot. Their viewership's going down. You know why? People are starting to go back to work.
That's how it goes, huh?
No, I'm cool. Because the content is what you want.
Yeah, it's nice that you're doing fine, but at the